one thing that I hope to accomplish with helping to demystify practices of mindfulness is helping others to realize through this connection with themselves that there are practical and accessible ways to settle the nerves, find more clarity, more peace of mind, more freedom, a wider range of choices, especially in moments where stress and overwhelm may be out there.
Welcome back to the Me and Podcast, where we explore the journeys of inspiring individuals and their unique paths to self-discovery and personal growth. In today's episode, we're diving into the captivating world of mindfulness with our guest, Timothy Lewis, a mindfulness and embodied movement educator. Prepare for an enlightening conversation with Timothy as he shares his insights on the interplay of mindfulness, movement, and emotional intelligence in our journey towards self-awareness and improved well-being. So the backstory, how Timothy and I met and why we're here today, a few months ago, I stuck my head in on a Black men's retreat. And Timothy was one of the guys I connected with. We ended up taking a cold plunge together, which was funny as hell, right? And we actually took the cold plunge with Danny as well. And it was so funny that the experience that I walked away from that day with is that we have so many tools that are available to us in certain aspects of life that are ever present. Danny is a yoga instructor and understands the importance of breath work and moving with your breath. But as soon as the cold water hit you guys, it was a very different experience, right? And the funny part about it is that since I approach a lot of these practices, and we'll go more into it from a very scientific or performance-based standpoint, you guys thought we were only going in once. So then when I broke the news that, no, we're going back out and we're going to have a recovery period, and then we're going back in 2 more times, it was interesting to see the look on your face. But what was cool about that experience, we had some amazing conversations. And in that mindfulness coaching space ties so much into the emotional intelligence work, the meeting concept of being your best self by making investments in your physical, spiritual, and mental well-being. And here we are today. I'm learning from him. I'm excited for him to share his journey and his mindfulness thoughts, ideas that can make you a little bit better, or at least demystify some of the mindfulness conversation so that you can put some of this into practice in your life. Timothy, welcome to the show, sir.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, we're going to jump right in, and I'm going to start with right away. What is an embodied movement educator?
An embodied movement educator is one who helps others to come into connection with being inside of their body. And so I use different practices to help people to engage with that type of work. In other words, I can share a personal experience. One of the things about being embodied, being in this body, right? It took me a long time to figure out what that meant for myself. I grew up an athlete, grew up a dancer, and also doing different types of movement modalities. And so for me, learning what it means to be in this body, to actually be able to feel from a physical standpoint was, and it continues to be, a long time practice. And so as an embodied movement educator, I use tools like yoga. I use tools like the Afro-Brazilian martial art of capoeira. I use mindful movement to help people to be in relation with their body.
I like that. So tell us a little bit about you so we get to humanize Timothy Lewis for the audience today.
Yeah, absolutely. So I was born and raised in Flint, Michigan. I'm the youngest of 4 boys. And like I said earlier, I grew up very much involved in athletics, in the arts. I've always been a naturally curious person. And so I've allowed my curiosity to really lead me into a lot of different spaces. I also grew up a musician. I don't talk about that.
What instrument?
I started playing the clarinet.
I can understand why you would. Sorry. Sorry to all the clarinet players. No offense.
None taken. It's interesting because I remember the very first day that I walked into the music room, and the teacher had invited all of us to go into the closet and pick an instrument. And there was nothing particularly like that called out about the clarinet, but it's not like I grew up saying, I want to play the clarinet.
You actually did grow up saying you want to play it because you picked that instrument.
But it was the first one that I picked. It was the first one that I picked.
Right.
And so I took my clarinet home, and
I'm sorry. You took your clarinet home.
I took my clarinet home, and I was actually very good at it.
Okay, let me go back to the clarinet. This is just me, Timothy, but go ahead. All right, you took your clarinet home.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so I played music growing up. I also grew up dancing, grew up tap dancing, grew up also practicing ballet and jazz. And for me, the arts became like a gateway to better understanding myself and also ultimately learning how to listen to myself. I think these two things also were instrumental in helping me to develop a certain level of appreciation for practice in general, because it was something that once I started to engage in, whether it was music, whether it was dance, it was something that I regularly came back to. And like I said, I was really good at playing my clarinet. Over time, this is an important part of the story, because over time, what happened is I also played and taught myself to play every single woodwind instrument, and I also taught myself to play the piano.
I think you're doing better now. Okay. All right. Lead with the piano and then go backward. I appreciate the practice comment, because in anything that we do in life, especially when we're younger, we understand the importance of practice, and we practice repeatedly. We get better over time. But strangely enough, when we get into, and this goes into mindfulness, but as we get older, we expect to be great at things when we start. And a lot of us miss the acumen of practicing to get us forward, right? So I'm just saying, no, I get it, that I like that. You've taught yourself to play moving forward?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
And another thing that was really important for me when I talk about like growing up in Flint, Michigan, is exposure outside of that space. So it wasn't until when I graduated from high school, I went to Howard University, where I studied biology and chemistry. And so Howard University was really the first place that helped me to understand what it meant to be from Flint, Michigan, because the reaction that I would get anytime I said I'm from Flint was one of maybe two things. One was either people would say, "Oh, I'm sorry to hear that." The other thing that people would say was, "I'm glad you made it out."
Wow.
And I didn't understand either of these things until I started to look at some of the documentaries that were out there, some of the perception of what it meant to be from Flint, because from within that space, I grew up in a 2-parent household, 3 older brothers, many friends, many mentors, things like that. And for me, being from Flint was not necessarily a bad thing.
Mm-hmm.
So I went on to study biology and chemistry at Howard University. This is also where I was exposed to the world of research. I started doing cancer biology research for the U.S. Army. I was doing research at Walter Reed Army Institute of Research. And that kind of led me down or further down this road of an appreciation for science in general.
Bridge us to the gap from biology, cancer research to mindfulness coach.
Yeah.
That like, how do you bridge that part of the conversation?
I think it's all bridged through curiosity.
Okay.
And always following my curiosity. So I was in a PhD program at the University of Chicago, and there was this area of tension in my life between absolutely loving what I was doing, but not necessarily liking the quality of my life. So this was a period of time for me where I had the first opportunity to really look at what were my expectations versus where were my expectations actually scaffolded by the idea of being a first generation college student, the first to go on to graduate school, the first to need to have a higher level degree. And so when I left the program after terminal masters, and I went to travel with an international exchange program. I spent 6 months traveling through 25 different cities and living with host families all over the world. And when I came back to the US, this is the time where I was literally starting from scratch. And when I look back on sort of my history, sort of this through line through everything was always this space of being a teacher or an educator of some sort. So when I came back to the US, I applied for teaching programs, teaching certification programs, and I became an educator in the New York City area. Bridging that gap to specifically being a mindfulness coach, I would say, again, has been a trail of following curiosity, finding practices that work for me in terms of helping me to connect better to myself, and also answering some of the bigger existential questions that I had since I was a little boy.
How do you let go of the scaffolding? What other people wanted for you? Like what, how, because I'm sure there's so many people who are, I don't want to say trapped in that space, but who are living lives that it's for someone else, right? So how did you let go of that?
At the time, I wouldn't describe it as easy ever, but being able to ask myself, what is the life that I want to live? And especially during that time, I think creating the space to be able to look at my, at the time, current situation, where I was standing in the moment, and creating a space between what was the experience that I would rather have. So again, like I was talking about earlier, when there are so many experiences that I had as a youngster that were all about creativity and music and being able to move around and experience different aspects of life. And those were things that I deeply appreciated. And I didn't have those at the time. And so creating the space helped me to realize that the direction I was going, it wasn't necessarily my direction.
Just curiously, coolest country you saw in that 25 city trip?
Coolest country I saw. I'd have to say Germany.
Oh, Germany. Yeah. A little bit more on that.
Specifically Germany, because it was one of my first experiences in Europe. And at the time, I had a lot of misconceptions about what I would experience when I went to Europe, specifically in Germany. And I had the opportunity to experience Germany on a couple different levels, the East and the West. And it was fascinating. It was dynamic, and it was not like I necessarily thought it was going to be. The people were actually very warm. I felt well received, and I fell in love with the culture. I liked it a lot.
When I hear Germany, I hear, I shouldn't say, I feel structure, very structured, different than most of the other places that you would think someone who's into mindfulness would go from. Like you'd hear people who saying, I found mindfulness in Asia when you're traveling there. What are some of the other countries?
Finland, Denmark, Poland. That was an interesting one as well. Yeah, that was really interesting. I actually stayed in a monastery when I was in Poland.
What was that like? I keep wanting to do that.
Stay in a monastery?
I want to spend some time in a monastery. There was at least I'm being real. There was at some point in 2019 where I was like, I should do this for a year. I don't know where I was in life, but that was one of the things that I had. I think I spent a lot of time overseas, a lot of time alone. And when transitioning back to the US, I figured why not this was an inflection point in life where I was like, I can do something like this for an extended period of time. What was the draw for you? What was that feeling or experience for you?
I enjoyed the solitude. I enjoyed the mystery of it. Yeah, that was the solitude and the mystery.
Teaching in New York City, that's a different experience.
Super.
Yeah. What are you learning about yourself as you're going through that process?
First, ending up in New York City, I came to New York City with, I would say, big eyes for the city, not really understanding what it meant to live in a place like New York City. And so I remember when I was applying for the New York City Teaching Fellows, and there was a question on the application where it asked, we had to list by preference the borough that we wanted to work in. Naturally, the only borough that I knew of was Manhattan. So that was my first choice. And then maybe my second choice was, or something like that.
I'm disappointed that you don't lead with Brooklyn.
I didn't know Brooklyn. I just didn't know. But here's the thing is, Then there was a drop down question and it said, is there a reason why you wouldn't teach in Brooklyn or the Bronx? And at that point, I was just honestly tired of answering long form questions. And I said, you know what? I'm just going to put the Bronx first. And that's where I ended up. And so what I learned teaching in New York City, wow, I learned a lot about myself, the ability to connect with so many different young people, yet at the same time, seeing so many similarities from my experience. I think overall, teaching in the New York City Department of Education really helped me to understand education on a different level. And when I say a different level, meaning like beyond just this kind of huge system that doesn't necessarily have a name or a face, and really bringing it to a personal level. That for me was an important part of teaching in the system because it can be so overwhelming on so many levels for the teachers, for students, for administrators.
What's coming to me now is that research, teaching, and then mindfulness. In my head, I've always wanted to have that very practical approach to mindfulness where, and I apologize for anyone who would be offended by me saying woo-woo, I want the science-based aspect of it. And I'm hoping maybe as we go into the mindfulness conversation, we can talk about it in that way, because everyone thinks it's this abstract thing that's out there that's we shouldn't seek or we shouldn't attain, but it's grounded in research. It's grounded in science. What's the impact that you're hoping to make in this switch to being a mindfulness coach?
Backtrack just a moment.
Cool.
Because as a classroom teacher, that's the time where I met my own personal yoga practice. Mm-hmm. So when I say yoga practice, I'm talking about yoga asana practice. That was the period of time for me that I met that practice. And so one thing that was important for kind of bringing that practice to life was how I incorporated it into the classroom. So one of the questions that you were just asking about the practical application of it, like being able to settle a classroom down sometimes is as simple as literally asking everyone to just take a pause and let's all take a deep breath together. So one thing that I hope to accomplish with helping to demystify practices of mindfulness is helping others to realize through this connection with themselves that there are practical and accessible ways to settle the nerves, find more clarity, more peace of mind, more freedom, a wider range of choices, especially in moments where stress and overwhelm may be out there.
Or what makes you dive into becoming a certified mindfulness coach or a yoga instructor? What's that next inflection point that gets you down that path?
There was a greater depth that I experienced in the yoga practice when I was experiencing burnout as a classroom teacher. So I think I was in maybe my 8th or 9th year of teaching, and I needed something to keep me going. And I remember I was like 1 foot out the door, and I went into my back prep room and I saw an advertisement for a yoga teaching certification. And this is after I had a regular practice, but this particular certification felt like it was calling to me, especially at that time, because like I said, I was not necessarily in the greatest of space as a teacher. And so for me, there was a greater depth that I experienced going through my first 200-hour yoga teacher training. And so
and just in the recent past, it's coming to me more and more that we seek certain tools when we hit the wall. Mm-hmm. And it's such an interesting concept that many athletes would say, I should have those tools so I don't hit the wall, right? It's one of those really, I don't know if it's the chicken and egg situation or which comes first, but it's one of the things that's more and more it comes to me. The practices, the tools, they're all there so that you don't have these issues. And how do you impart that thinking, that way of being into the younger generation so that they don't have those issues. It's one of those things, it's not something that we could solve now for sure, but it's one of those things that keeps coming up for me, right? Because a lot of the talk that we have in this area, it's like, how do you help people to do it? But I'm coming from a school of thought that you don't decrease stress, you increase your capacity to handle stress. So when I found yoga, when I found all those things, it was like, oh, this feels good for my body. I'm able to get through the day. But I was just, again, in that same curious space. Like, it would be cool then to transition a little bit more into how you see the mindfulness space, right? In my head, the mind is the engine, right? Its mindset starts there, curiosity, the brain's a muscle, so it can be exercised, neuroplasticity. These are all things that actually comes into my mind, right? Your mindset determines your behaviors, your motivation, and you can't perform to your highest potential if you're not mindful, if you're not emotionally well. I think there's a Zig Ziglar quote that says, you are what you are and where you are because of what you put into your mind. I connect mindfulness to emotional intelligence in certain ways. And now I'm going to start turning it over to you as the expert in this space. How do you define, and let's have a conversation on it in a simple way, because I think there's that demystification that often needs to happen. So mindfulness.
Yeah. So mindfulness is being with what is without a sense of judgment.
For the people who like me, who would be like, what does that mean? At some point in life.
Yeah. It means that the best analogy that I can, or one analogy that I can give is like thinking about clouds in the sky, thinking about that clouds come and clouds go. When we look up into the sky, we don't necessarily say, oh, that's a bad cloud, or, oh, that's a good cloud. And so we can start to think about some of the events in our lives in a similar way. And so what mindfulness does is over time, it helps to train us to be able to be with experiences in our life in that way.
So that's where the Swiss Army knife for life comes from.
Yeah.
Yeah. Tell me a little bit more about that, because I think that's one of the things you lean on. Right? Yeah.
Because the whole idea is, like you were saying earlier, there is like this sort of mystification when it comes to, or a certain mysticism when it comes to mindfulness, right? Sometimes we hear the word and there's this image of a person sitting in a particular posture, or maybe doing some things with their hands, or maybe even making some sounds. And one thing about when I think of myself as, when I say the Swiss Army knife of life's most stressful moments, you think about a Swiss Army knife, and there's so many different tools and different modalities that you can start to use to help for moments of stress. And so my approach is helping people to essentially develop their own toolkit, the toolkit that works for them. And so for some individuals, that might mean an entry point with a greater awareness and a better relationship with their breath. Earlier, you were talking about some of the aspects of the science. And so when our state of being changes, one of the first things that change in response is the breath. And so we can reverse engineer that and realize that in a moment that I'm experiencing stress or high anxiety or whatever the emotion might be, I can then use the breath in a way to relate the feeling or the response that I want to have. For some individuals, right, one of those tools of mindfulness might be to simply get things out of their head and to use maybe a writing practice. For some others, one aspect of it may be a moving practice. And so with each one of these, there are more than one way to do these practices, right? So when, for example, we're talking about a journaling practice, well, it could be using a set of prompts. It could be using sentence starters. It could be simply making a list, right? And when we talk about the Swiss Army knife for life's most stressful moments, it's literally having a toolkit that one can pull from depending on what the situation is calling for.
Since I'm learning here, so we have journaling as a tool, breath work, movement, yoga. What else?
We could talk. There's an aspect of also being mindful and being able to express in that way.
I've never even thought of talking as a mindfulness exercise.
So there's actually a practice that I like to use, and I call it talking into the void. And it's literally similar to a writing, journaling practice, but it's speaking thoughts, speaking emotions, speaking perhaps a reaction into a space that doesn't necessarily land in someone else's ears.
I'll give you this. It's an interesting one, because going back to the book that we were talking about, Search Inside Yourself, it actually goes through the idea of, by labeling your emotions, so that talking about it, labeling it, it activates the right, I think it's vertical prefrontal cortex or something like that. I know I probably messed that up. But by doing that, by labeling it, it's actually, when you're emotionally dysregulated, it's like having a lobotomy, like you don't think straight. But by labeling the emotions, you then take the power away from it. I've never just connected the dots, just talking into the void is a way of actually saying it. So now so talking is another one. Anything else?
Of course, there's the seated meditation practice.
I guess I see which is your least favorite of all the modalities.
It's not true, actually. It's not true, actually. Actually,
you know what? To be honest, it's my least favorite.
I very much look forward to my seated practice, actually. Yeah. But yeah, there was a moment there.
The seated moment, the seated meditation is part of, because all of those other things can happen at the same time when you're seated. Yeah. And sometimes it gets overwhelming for me. I think when I sit down now, I feel everything that's going on. And sometimes it's harder to go that way. But I guess it's the seated meditation. We'll add that one into it. You're not going to ever live this down, by the way. I'm not.
And then also what comes up for me, connecting to nature.
Okay.
Being outside, connecting to nature, the elements. Even so, when we talk about, for example, different movement modalities, there are also aspects of walking mindfully. Mm-hmm. There's eating mindfully, right?
So there's a lot more.
There are ways, there are a ton more. And it's actually one of the brilliant things about working with so many different types of people is that in a coaching context, it's an opportunity to see where people can bring in mindfulness into their everyday lives. The challenge is moving away from a space of here's a kind of a recipe of things that you can do versus let me meet you where you are, and then we can bring aspects of mindfulness into it. So aspects of having an open mind, even when it comes to, say, observing an object closely. Looking at a pen for the first time can be an exercise in mindfulness.
So you can be, what's coming up is that there's an opportunity everywhere to be mindful.
Yeah. And it's funny because I was actually having a conversation with someone recently, and at some point we've all been or practiced mindfulness, right? This idea of being or having a learner's mind the first time that we try something, or being curious, having a sense of non-judgmental nature towards something. And the practice then becomes bringing ourselves back to it and bringing these practices, bringing attention and intention into these practices.
All right. Like that. I'm going to throw some things at you as I've thought of mindfulness, and then you can tell me what comes up for you in the same way. I'm learning, right? So tell me what comes up. Mindfulness, know thyself. How do you translate that?
I think mindfulness is an amazing tool to help better understand oneself.
How we do that?
Through practice.
All right. Everything through practice.
Essentially.
Happiness as a default state of mind.
Yes. So here's the thing. I think in so many instances, there's this quest for happiness, right? Ultimately to be happy, whether it be in relationship, whether it be in particular work that's done in the world. And it's possible to start from a place of happiness as simply being one's natural state. And so, yes, I do believe that it's possible to look at happiness as a default state.
Relaxed and alert at the same time.
The first thing that comes up for me is often the encouragement to be in a body that's relaxed yet alert, whether that be in a seated posture or really in everyday life.
It's like going back to practicing what you want to be, right? It's like opportunities in each aspect of life to be intentional. So in that same place of performance, a relaxed mind is a focused and stable mind. It's clear and it's calm. So I think that's what's tying all of those things in, right? Knowing yourself, having a default that you would go back to even when you come off center.
Just a quick pause to say thank you for listening. And if you're enjoying this episode, don't forget to subscribe to the Me Inc. podcast for more inspiring stories and practical tips on your personal growth and well-being. Your support means the world to me. Now, let's dive back into our enlightening conversation.
About reps and practice.
Mm-hmm.
And so with the practice of meditation, there is the tendency for the mind to wander. That's what it essentially does. And so the exercise is constantly bringing it back to an anchor. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. The brain is a muscle. So that is, the gym for the brain, right? And still, this is just how my mind's working. I'm all over the place because this is the first time I thought or I talked about the Me Inc. concept, meditation, mindfulness, that portion of it was the hardest part for me to relate to others because here I am as an accountant trying to speak to other accountants about being mindful, the myths of it. One of the things that individuals have is that, and you hear this often, right? I can't meditate. And there's this concept of when you sit down, your mind becomes clear. And for you to be doing it well, your mind has to be clear. How do we demystify that or take that away from someone not wanting to sit or feeling like they can't get the benefits of this just sitting or just any of the mindfulness practices?
I think starting from a place of unpacking that idea to begin with, like where do we get the idea that to sit down and close one's eyes means that the brain stops? Where does that come from?
I saw it in movies. I looked at a lot of kung fu movies growing up and stuff, and I was like, maybe.
Yeah, because that is a thing that comes up often is a person says, oh, I can't meditate. And there's actually a spiritual scripture that says it is done unto you as you believe. And so if you believe that you sit down and you can't meditate, then maybe I'm not going to tell you that you necessarily can, but if you're open to trying, then we can continue to come back to different ways to practice that. One of the things that I like to challenge beginners with sometimes is sit with a piece of paper and your eyes are closed, and go ahead and try to close your eyes, meditate, and as thoughts come up, if you feel like you need to engage with them in some way, then write it down and not look at what you're writing, but just engage in the practice of writing. And afterwards, if you want to look at it and make sense of it or see what came up, you can engage with your thoughts in that way. But I think it becomes like we were saying earlier about meditation as exercise, developing that muscle to be able to sit and shift the relationship with the thoughts as they happen, not stop them or necessarily need them to be any different type of way.
Yeah, the whole point of just not having them to be any type of way. But that's hard. What else other than, let's say, writing or interacting with the thoughts in that way, what other tips would you say, at least in that space, that would say that the person who's saying, I can't do this, what is another piece of advice you might be able to give?
In the beginning, to engage with the thoughts, or here's the thing. One of my teachers talk about and encourage this mindset of having this very neutral relationship to thoughts that happen as they come up, and essentially treating them as like friends at a party. And so if you were the guest of honor in a party, then your friend who walks in, you're going to have a pretty neutral acceptance of them, right? And the same is true for whoever else walks in. So to be able to engage with the thoughts and actually watch it almost like you're watching TV. When you're sitting and watching TV, think about how there are some people who might throw things at the screen or interact in a different way. But for the most part, being able to just simply watch and observe, there's a lot of power in taking the seat of observer. And so that is one that I would recommend for sure, challenging oneself to be the observer.
The observer's effect does create the state for you. It's like you label it as that, and then it becomes that. One of the things that I hear a lot now is people talking about being triggered. I do think we have the ability to control our emotions. I do believe we have the ability to do a lot of that. But you hear a lot, I'm triggered. How do I address being triggered? What's that mindful way of working through that experience?
The awareness of a trigger is one step already. I think an additional layer to that is developing a relationship for understanding how a trigger might show up in the physical body. So, for example, I'll speak for myself. There are times where I can be triggered and my shoulders are practically up against my ears. So much tension in my shoulders, my neck. And so becoming aware of how these triggers might show up in the physical body. The same is true for posture in general. We can start to become aware of how we're holding our bodies, whether it's seated or standing. And so that's another layer to understanding how particular triggers might show up in the physical body.
What we think, do, pay attention to changes the structure and functions of our brain.
So that's the whole premise of neuroplasticity in a way. These well-trodden pathways become the neural connections that are happening. And so when we tend to, for example, having a recurring pattern of thought create certain networks to communicate with each other. And so the same is true for what's possible when it comes to redirecting our attention towards perhaps experiences that are more neutral and ultimately experiences that more err toward the positive side.
It's back to that intention part of it. Every time you create an intention, you are subtly forming and reinforcing a mental habits in that same space of mindfulness. How do you approach that same? Because when we sit, those interesting thoughts come up. How do we practice letting them go?
I think there at one point there's a natural tendency of the thought to go away on its own. Think about clouds in the sky. The clouds are going to pass. Those thoughts are going to pass. I think with practice, what happens is that we have the potential to bring our awareness to something that is more neutral. And so that more neutral thing might be the sensation of the feet touching the floor. And that might be a starting place so that over time, we can start to then direct our awareness, attention, and intention towards things that we actually want. And I think an important thing to note here about intention is in the same way that one of the things that mindfulness encourages is this idea of non-attachment. And so in the same way that we don't want to necessarily grasp or reach for these negative thoughts with our intentions as well, there's a certain level of non-attachment that we want. Not to say that we don't expect them, but I think it's important that we have a certain level of not gripping non-attachment when it comes to our intentions as well.
So you said awareness, intention, and the third part?
Attention?
Awareness, attention, intention. So someone wanting to start out, if I today said I wanted to be a little bit more mindful, first maybe we can say some of the benefits, and then maybe, I don't know if this sounds for you, then maybe just a few short practices that we can actually do if you're just starting out.
Right now, one of the major benefits is to turn down the noise in the world. The world it's fast, it's noisy. And so one of the greatest benefits is turning down that noise so that there's a greater attunement to the voice, the internal voice. There's a certain guidance that every single one of us we have, but through whether it be noise of the media or it's noise of our past or it's noise of a doomed future, there's a way to turn things down and realize a deeper truth. And so that's one of the greatest benefits of developing a mindfulness practice. One of the others is shifting from, and I guess this kind of ties into it because it helps us to shift from a mind full of mess versus actually the full utility of the mind. And that extends beyond just what we typically think about in this 3 pounds of brain inside, because our mind is very much it governs the way we eat. It governs the way that we are in relationship with ourselves and others. And developing a mindfulness practice really extends out beyond just the person into the way they show up in the world, the relationship with work, a greater satisfaction overall with the quality of life. I often talk about greater energy, greater freedom, and greater clarity. And so for one who is interested in starting a mindfulness practice, one of the first things that I like to do is I actually like to take an inventory for where an individual is and what they're open to. For some individuals, starting off with a seated meditation practice is the best place, especially if they're constantly on the go. They could use some settling and to be able to just slow things down. For
seated how? Because that's one of the things, right? So you don't have to be seated in the lotus position. So simplify it. Just we're starting out again. How do I approach that?
We're taking a relaxed yet firm position, seated. One can sit in the chair. One can sit on the floor. One can sit with a back support up against the wall. I think the possibilities are endless.
Because everyone's going to see right away when you say sitting and meditating, someone sees someone legs crossed, sitting, some mudra, right? And I think it's much, much simpler than that. And if we can do it in so many aspects of life, there's so many tools, then our ability to access those tools should be simple, right?
It's interesting that you say that because I was reflecting the other day how often we'll start a practice and we'll say, okay, take a seated position. Then everybody starts to like shift and change. And I'm like, wait, if you have to change, then you weren't comfortable before? Like what just happened? But I think it is important to note that.
Sometimes just bringing awareness to it happens.
And it is important because if the body is not comfortable, then it's going to start calling out. And so that adds a layer of distraction for some, especially when first starting out.
So I'm busy as hell, running on all cylinders. If I sit down for whatever period of time and I'm going to pass out, how do I avoid that?
You don't.
You don't?
If you pass out, that's what you needed.
Okay. All right. You know what? This is good. Thank you. I got what I needed.
No, it's interesting too, because again, the nature of, I won't say the nature, there's a tendency also to judge. Was this a good meditation? Was this a bad meditation? Was this my mind was super busy? And so if one falls asleep, then one falls asleep.
Okay. Just can't snore. I think I've had that happen in a couple of places. All right. You can't snore. Okay. So anything else you have on that? Starting out, just sit for a few moments. How long were you sitting?
So in terms of it, so that was a recommendation if one is interested in, say, starting from a position of beginning a mindfulness practice with meditation.
You're coaching me, you're giving me a few things to start with. So it was just a few of the tools, the practical way of starting it. That's all we're going. So we were saying that sitting was one way. Anything else of starting?
Breath awareness.
Okay.
I love to start with simply bringing awareness to one breath a day. That's a great starting place for beginning a mindfulness practice as well, just simply bringing the awareness to one full cycle of breath. I am breathing in and I am breathing out.
Okay, that's just the prompt. It almost seems too simple. I'm feeling more mindful already. Okay, that's cool. Anything else to add?
Those are two of the most accessible starting points.
Okay.
And when I say most accessible, meaning like it's not going to bring up the, oh, I can't get out into nature, or, oh, I don't have time for, or, oh, I don't, because we can bring our awareness to a breath, whether we're sitting on a bus, whether we're sitting on a train, whether we are in a car waiting for the kids to get out of soccer practice.
As we go to the tail end of this conversation is your EQI assessment, right? And what you learned. So must say that all the work that Timothy is doing showed up on his emotional intelligence assessment. So many parts of the assessment was off the chart. So I was sharing that with him, self-regard. A bunch of other things were actually in spaces and places where I was curious, what is your practice? How do you get there? And maybe we can explore some of that as after you share what you learned from the EQI assessment.
One thing that I've learned from the EQI assessment is there's an area of growth for expression of not just emotion, but just expression in general. This resonates with me, especially in the space that I am personally and the growth that I look to have for myself. Another thing that I learned that is especially interesting is I think the EQI speaks to this idea, or I actually wrote about this in my journal one time, about how I tend to be in things I'm more of a marathoner versus this sprint to the finish line type of person. And that showed up in my EQI as well. And this is something that I've noticed about myself through writing, through different experiences, etc.
Share a little bit more about that, because but I hear it in a different way, and I just want you to unpack that a little bit more. The marathon person, are you sharing that with as mindful as you're trying to be? You observe a lot.
I do.
And you are very intentional with your action. How do you think that shows up on the other side for the people that you're interacting with? So this is just part of what just popped into my head. Part of being in this space with me is just having to entertain those thoughts.
I think it would be interesting actually to ask different people that in different contexts, right? So for example, I think about how that might show up. Say for example, I'll give you a more recent example. In the Afro-Brazilian martial art that I do in capoeira, right? I didn't start I wasn't good. There was nothing in fact, when I first started capoeira, like everything probably pointed to, I should probably quit. I was an adult when I started. I didn't necessarily have the body for it. And even my teacher looked at things and he's pretty terrible. But over time, and with continued practice, continuing to show up, that has changed. And so I think in that context, people would probably see me in one way. And then when it comes to like as a classroom teacher or even in my yoga practice. So I think in different ways, I might show up different depending on the context.
Yeah, okay. No, I'm just going, as you're saying that, I'm going, I really thank God you found that clarinet so early. I couldn't help it. I was just sitting on that one. But no, as it shows, though, that space in the emotional intelligence place being founded in mindfulness, it shows up in the practice that you're doing. And that's the one way we were just sharing a little while ago. A lot of the assessments are out there are static, but this one changes based on the work that you're doing, right? We can, if we are intentional about what we do, we can practice who we want to become. And that's one of the things that's burned into my head. In this space, as we're wrapping it up, the through line to your life, as you think about it, and you think about where you are now, what are some of those thoughts that come up for you that you would want to share? What's that one thing to your life? I heard curiosity, I heard practice, but what's that through line that comes through life for you that's supporting you where you are standing today?
I would say follow your curiosity, continue following the curiosity, and it's all practice. Mindfulness can be, and it is, more than we often think. And so be curious about what's possible. Continue to ask that question, what's possible? So be curious, keep practicing. And mindfulness is the Swiss Army knife for life's most stressful moments.
Thank you so much. I appreciate the time today. I'm happy that I now know you own a clarinet. Man, every time I see you now, I'm going to give you a hard time. I've learned a bunch and looking forward to continuing to learn from you in this space. This is such important work that you're doing. Grateful for who you are and how you're showing up in the world, man.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right.
So what stayed with me from this episode, and it's so hard to be concise with some of the episodes that we go through, but what stayed with me is that we can be mindful in so many areas of life. The way we walk, the way we talk, how we sit, how we generally engage with the world. Also, mindfulness is the foundation of emotional intelligence, being aware of yourself and how we are interacting with the world. But the benefit, the primary benefit, and I love the way Timothy put it forward, is that mindfulness is a way of us turning down the noise of the world. And that one really stuck with me. I also appreciated his idea of being mindful through practice, curiosity, and understanding that mindfulness is the Swiss Army knife when life throws stress your way. And getting started is as easy as being mindful of one single breath every day.
I appreciate you listening to this episode. If you find value in what you've heard today, please like and share, and don't hesitate reaching out to me if there's any way that I can be of service. Nigel@meinkhelp.com or Nigel Franklin Way on Instagram. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your mental energy. Thank you for listening. And until we meet again in this space, take good care of you.